Part 1. The Mysterious Invitation. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when Sarah and her family first saw the house. Tucked away on the outskirts of a small town, the house seemed abandoned, almost as if time had forgotten it. The house was large, with peeling paint, overgrown ivy crawling up the walls, and an eerie silence surrounding it. It had stood for decades, its windows dark, reflecting nothing but the empty fields beyond. The real estate agent, an older man with a quiet voice, told them the house had been on the market for years, but no one had dared to buy it. Sarah, her husband James, and their 2 children, Lily and Ben, were looking for a fresh start, a place away from the city. They had heard rumors of the house's dark past but dismissed them as mere superstition. Sarah was drawn to it, sensing that this would be the perfect home for their family, despite its weathered exterior. They decided to take the leap. The first sign that something was off came the very next day. As they unpacked their belongings, Sarah noticed an old, weathered envelope in the mailbox, no return address, just her name written in a shaky hand. Opening it, she found a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. The message read, "If you choose to stay in this house, you will never leave the same. Those who came before you never did. This house holds secrets, and it is hungry. Beware what you wish for." Asterisk. The letter sent a chill down Sarah's spine. At first, she thought it was some sort of prank. Maybe the former owner, trying to scare away potential buyers. But the more she thought about it, the more unsettling it seemed. She tried to brush it off as nothing but a joke, but a sense of unease lingered in her mind. James, being practical, laughed it off, calling it just some weird coincidence. The kids, however, were not so convinced. Lily, her daughter, had an odd feeling about the house from the beginning, and Ben, her younger son, kept asking questions about the old man who used to live there. The day continued with Sarah trying to settle in, but the house didn't feel like a home. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed amplified, as though the house itself was alive, watching them. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she heard something. A soft, distant whisper. A voice, low, almost inaudible. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to the wind or her imagination. But it was persistent. The sound of footsteps, echoing through the dark, empty hallways of the house. It was then that Sarah realized the house wasn't just old, it was watching them. Part 2. Strange events begin. The first few days in the house were filled with the typical chaos of unpacking and settling in. But as the week progressed, the strange events started to escalate, and Sarah began to feel a growing sense of discomfort. It wasn't anything overt at first, just subtle things that couldn't easily be explained. A picture frame on the mantel would be found in a different position, small items would go missing, only to reappear days later in places they couldn't have been moved to. It felt as though something, or someone, was watching them, waiting for them to notice. The most unsettling experience occurred one evening when Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She was alone, as James had taken the children out for a walk. The kitchen had a large window that looked out over the garden, and as Sarah chopped vegetables, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was staring at her from the darkened yard. At first, she told herself it was just her imagination, the shadows playing tricks in the fading light. But then, she saw something move, quickly, just on the edge of her vision. She turned toward the window, heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the empty garden and the whispering trees. That night, as Sarah was settling in bed, she heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, they weren't distant. They were closer, deliberate, as if someone was walking through the hallway just outside her bedroom door. She held her breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. Her pulse quickened, but there was no knock, no voice, just the soft, steady sound of breathing on the other side. Sarah's mind raced. She got out of bed and opened the door, expecting to see James or the children standing there. But the hallway was empty. No one was in sight. She checked the kids' rooms, but both Lily and Ben were sound asleep. There was no explanation for what she had heard. The following night, the events became even more bizarre. As Sarah was walking through the living room, she felt a cold breeze brush past her, despite the windows being shut. The air grew suddenly heavy, as though the house itself was exhaling, and then she saw it, faint, almost imperceptible, a shadow that moved across the wall. It wasn't her reflection, nor the flickering of the fireplace, it was something else, something unnatural. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was the wind, the house settling, or even stress. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The house was changing, and as the days went on, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the presence within it growing stronger, more insistent. Part 3, The Hidden Room. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Sarah and her family moved into the house, and the strange occurrences had become more frequent, each one unsettling her more than the last. The house seemed to have a life of its own, and Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that it was slowly pulling them into its dark history. She began to feel like she was living in a place that wasn't truly hers, as if it were a prison, its walls whispering secrets she wasn't meant to know. One afternoon, while Sarah was cleaning the attic, she discovered something that piqued her curiosity. Behind an old trunk, wedged into a dusty corner of the room, was a door, a small, unmarked door she had never noticed before. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but this door stood out, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden. It wasn't large, just a small wooden door, weathered with age, and it looked like it had never been opened. Sarah's pulse quickened. She felt an inexplicable pull to it, as if the house itself was urging her to investigate. She hesitated for a moment, a feeling of dread washing over her. But curiosity got the best of her. She grabbed a crowbar from the tool shed and carefully pried open the door. The creaking of the wood echoed through the attic as it opened, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into a dark, musty room beneath the house. Taking a deep breath, Sarah descended the stairs. The air grew colder as she reached the bottom, and she felt a strange, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. The room was small, filled with old furniture draped in white sheets. But the most striking thing was the walls, covered in strange symbols and drawings, as if someone had tried to tell a story with dark, erratic strokes. The smell of mildew mixed with something metallic, and the silence in the room felt suffocating. On one side of the room, Sarah noticed an old wooden chest. It was locked, but the key was sitting right beside it, lying on a dusty shelf. Trembling, she picked up the key, her hands shaking as she inserted it into the lock. The chest creaked open, revealing a bundle of old letters and a weathered journal. The journal belonged to the house's previous owner, a man named William Crane. Flipping through the pages, Sarah discovered chilling accounts of strange occurrences, similar to the ones she had been experiencing. William had written about hearing voices in the night, shadows moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. In the final entry, he wrote that the house was alive, and that the spirits of those who had lived there before were trapped within its walls. They needed something to escape, someone to replace them. The last page was filled with frantic scribbles: "Leave before it's too late. It will come for you." Asterisk. As Sarah read those words, she felt a cold breath on her neck. A chill ran down her spine, and she realized she was no longer alone in the room. Something was watching her from the shadows. Part 4, The First Encounter. The night after Sarah found the hidden room, things took a darker turn. She couldn't shake the unease from her discovery. The house, which had already felt unsettling, now seemed like a trap, a place that wanted to swallow her and her family whole. Sarah barely slept, her mind racing with the images from the journal. "It will come for you," the last line echoed in her head. But she told herself it was just the ramblings of a man pushed to madness. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing sense that something in the house was very wrong. The next evening, after dinner, Sarah decided to take a walk through the house to calm her nerves. James was reading in the living room, and the kids had gone to bed. As she passed through the hallway, she felt the air grow cold, like a sudden draft had swept through. It was then that she heard it, a soft sound, almost like a whisper, coming from upstairs. She froze. It sounded like someone was calling her name, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Sarah." The voice was faint, distant, and yet it felt so close. Her heart raced. Tentatively, she made her way up the stairs. The house felt unusually still, the silence oppressive, as though the very walls were holding their breath. As she reached the top of the stairs, she heard the sound again, clearer this time, but still distant. Sarah. It wasn't James. It wasn't the kids. She knew the house was empty, yet the voice seemed to come from just down the hall. The air felt heavier with each step she took, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as though something in the house was feeding off her fear. As she neared the source of the sound, her breath caught in her throat. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure. It was tall and shadowy, its features blurred and indistinct, as if it was part of the darkness itself. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching her. "Hello." Sarah's voice trembled, barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. Sarah's legs went weak. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. In a flash, the figure vanished, leaving only the cold, suffocating silence. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly backed away, her mind in a frenzy. As she turned to rush downstairs, she heard footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty house. She spun around, but no one was there. Terrified, she ran to the living room, where James was sitting, oblivious to what had just happened. But she knew she wasn't alone. The house had just made its first move. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she heard the whispers again, this time closer, more urgent, as though they were inside her head. "Leave, before it's too late." But she knew now, the house wasn't going to let her go so easily. Part 5, The Truth Unveiled. The days that followed the encounter with the shadowy figure were filled with dread. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was closing in on her, suffocating her with its dark presence. Every night, she was plagued by unsettling dreams of trapped souls, their faces twisted in agony, reaching out to her. By day, the whispers grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. It was as if the house itself was trying to communicate, warning her of something far worse than she had ever imagined. One afternoon, Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She went back to the hidden room in the attic, hoping to find more answers. As she rummaged through the old chest, she noticed something strange. Buried beneath the letters and the journal, there was another piece of paper, a yellowed map, drawn hastily, showing the layout of the house. At first, it seemed ordinary, but as Sarah studied it, she realized something horrifying. There was a hidden chamber beneath the floor of the living room, a place that wasn't marked on any of the other floor plans. Her hands trembled as she traced the lines of the map. The hidden chamber was labeled only with the word, sanctuary, but the ominous feeling it gave her was unmistakable. Something about it made her stomach turn. She had to see it for herself. That night, when James and the children were asleep, Sarah began to search the living room. She moved the furniture aside, and after what felt like hours, she finally found the spot. The floorboards were loose in one corner, revealing a small, narrow trapdoor hidden underneath the carpet. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lifted it, revealing a steep staircase that led down into darkness. With a mix of fear and determination, Sarah descended the stairs, the cold air growing thicker as she moved deeper into the earth beneath the house. At the bottom, the space opened into a small chamber. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols she had seen in the hidden room, and the floor was littered with old bones and ashes. It looked like some sort of ritual site, a place where sacrifices had been made. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, stained with what appeared to be dried blood. A single candle burned on the altar, its flame flickering despite the lack of any wind. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the house wasn't just haunted, it had been built for something far more sinister. This was no ordinary house. It had been constructed as a vessel, a place to trap spirits, to keep them from escaping. The ritual sacrifices performed here had been meant to feed the house, to feed whatever dark force resided within it. Her mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The whispers, the shadows, the cold spots, it wasn't just the house that was alive, the house was feeding off them. Sarah and her family weren't just guests in this place, they were the next victims, the next offering to the dark entity that controlled everything. The house wasn't a home. It was a prison. As the realization sank in, Sarah felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there. The air around her grew thick with malevolent energy. The house was awake. It knew she had discovered its secret. And it was not going to let her leave. Part 6. Escape or become one of them. The terror Sarah felt in the hidden chamber beneath the house stayed with her long after she left that night. She could feel the house watching her. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the wind felt like it was directed at her. She now understood the true nature of the house. It wasn't just haunted, it was a prison for lost souls, a place that trapped those who dared to live within its walls. And worse, it was hungry, feeding off the fear and pain of its occupants. The following morning, Sarah tried to act normal in front of her family, but the weight of her discovery was too much. She had to leave. There was no time to waste. The house had been feeding off their presence for too long, and every day they stayed, they grew closer to becoming a part of it. She tried to talk to James, but he didn't understand. He dismissed her fears, chalking them up to stress or exhaustion. He had no idea what was really happening. Sarah knew that if she didn't act soon, it would be too late. But every time she tried to leave, the house seemed to tighten its grip. The door handles wouldn't turn, the windows wouldn't open, and even when she packed their bags, they would mysteriously be unpacked again the moment she turned away. It was as though the house was refusing to let them go. Desperate, Sarah decided to confront the house head-on. That night, she went back to the hidden chamber beneath the living room, determined to end it. She couldn't let her family fall victim to the same fate as the countless others before them. The air in the room was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows seemed to grow taller, watching her with malevolent eyes. She had to destroy whatever evil force had made this house its home. As Sarah approached the altar, she felt a presence behind her, a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned around, but there was nothing there. Her heart raced. The temperature in the room plummeted. It was then that she realized, the house was alive, but it wasn't just the house. It was the spirits, the trapped souls, pulling at her, trying to drag her into their realm. She felt the floor beneath her tremble as the walls closed in. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Leave, or become one of us. They were not just voices, they were the voices of the lost, the souls who had been consumed by the house over the years, now desperate for release. But their release would come at a price, Sarah's soul. She ran up the stairs, hearing the footsteps behind her, feeling the cold hands grabbing at her clothes. She bolted through the living room, screaming for James, but when she turned around, she saw him standing in the doorway. His eyes were blank, as though he had been taken by the house. And then it happened. In an instant, the walls seemed to close in on them. The air grew thick with darkness, and Sarah realized, with a cold rush of horror, that they had already become a part of the house. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The house had claimed them. As the last scream echoed through the walls, the house returned to silence. A new family moved in weeks later, unaware of the house's dark history. The cycle was about to begin again. And somewhere in the shadows, Sarah and James were waiting, no longer living, but no longer dead, just part of the house, forever. As the darkness closes in, our journey tonight comes to an end, but the shadows still whisper their secrets, and some stories are better left untold, or are they? If you've made it this far, you've felt the chill of the unknown, and remember, this won't be our last meeting. The night is never truly silent, and there's always something lurking, watching, waiting. Until we cross paths again, stay vigilant, and sleep tight, if you can. If you enjoy this story, so please subscribe my channel and set bell icon on all. Also share my video to others and like my video as appreciation. Thanks.